Well, welcome to session number 4. This evening, we're going to be looking at the Johannine tradition, the Gospel of John, and I think you will find it is a quite different one from what we have seen so far. If you had a chance even to look at the Gospel passage that I outlined for you from 12 to 20, well, really to 19, it's very different, and we'll talk a lot about that today. But I also want to begin, as I did last time, by talking, first of all, reviewing a little bit of what we talked about. And then we're also going to look at 3 other contributions, if you will, to our overall understanding of the Passion. We're going to spend a couple of minutes looking at the letter to the Hebrews. We're going to spend a couple of minutes looking at Paul's letter to the Philippians, and a little bit of time looking at the first letter of Peter. All of those readings help to form our understanding of the Passion. Just like art does, the readings that we read in proximity to the Passion also help us understand it and fill in a lot of the blanks. And there's much more that we could look at, but we're simply not able to do all of it. So let me share my screen with you and we'll get started. As I said, I wanted to start with a little bit of a review from last week. Just to remind you that we spent some time at the beginning examining this whole idea of suffering from the vantage point of the Hebrew tradition, which is our Judeo-Christian roots. And we found that suffering really begins with the fall, with creation and the fall. And we found out also that Israel's understanding of sin and suffering was really a corporate reality. Oftentimes the whole nation would suffer because a king made a bad decision. Think of that moment when David decided to count the people, and who paid the price? It was the people who paid the price. In spite of that, there was still this sense that basically if you did good, you would be blessed, and if you did evil, you would be punished. This worked for a fairly long time until we get to the exilic period and the post-exilic period, when things began to shift. There simply was so much unexplained suffering that Israel began to seek other explanations. They started to attribute suffering, unmerited suffering to Satan or to some demonic force. They began to argue against the idea that corporate suffering was valid and it should be the person who does evil who suffers and not everyone around them. There was an increasing awareness of the fact that there was a life beyond this one, where if you weren't rewarded in this life, you could be rewarded in the next. Or if you weren't punished in this life, you could be punished in the next. So these were all various ideas that began to emerge and have an impact on our tradition. We then moved to an examination of several biblical images that play a really important part in the Passion account. One is the story of the Passover lamb in Exodus. A second was the songs that surround the servant in Isaiah. A third was the righteous one in the book of wisdom. What's unique and interesting about all of them is in the Old Testament tradition, they were instruments of God. God was not the Passover lamb, God was not the servant who suffered, and God was not the righteous one being persecuted. Rather, these were instruments who served God and served God's purpose. What we find in the New Testament tradition is that these images now get merged into the person of Jesus of Nazareth. Suffering becomes a part of the divine personality, if you will. And we're going to talk more about that because we'll see it even more today. Then when we look to Matthew, we found several justifications for suffering. Matthew, again, talks much about this fulfillment of the divine plan and how Scripture is fulfilled. Matthew was the one who first says that Jesus shed his blood for the forgiveness of sins. We found it in Paul earlier than Matthew, of course, but this is the first gospel tradition where we saw it. And we also saw an interesting thing where Matthew, in his judgment of nature over Jesus' crucifixion, talks about the liberation of creation, particularly in the releasing of those who have died from the tomb. Then we turned to Luke's insights, and I use this word inevitability because I can't think of anything else to say about it. There's a sense in which the divine plan is going to unfold in spite of the people involved. The leaders desperately want to destroy Jesus, but they're powerless because it's not the right moment. We hear that Judas decides to betray Jesus because Satan enters him. So now we have this agency, a little bit of what I reflected on a minute ago, where the power of evil now begins to become more manifest. And then kind of the flip side, the opposite, was at the Last Supper, Jesus takes the moment to establish his enduring presence in the community through a memorial and a model. This is my body given for you. This is my blood, the blood of the covenant shed for you. And he invites the disciples to do the same. And in Luke, with his understanding of the fact that we are finishing one phase of salvation history, he prepares the community to enter into the next phase. One of the things that I wanted to, I said at the very beginning when we first started 3 sessions ago, was I talked about the distinction between the moral and the nature theodicy. And I'd like to just see where we're at on that. So I wanted to just review this a little bit with you for a moment. Some of the suffering that we have encountered thus far certainly fits in what you might call the moral theodicy. Jesus suffers because of human freedom. That is, human beings make decisions and they cause his suffering. Practically all of the human actors involved in our gospel accounts engage in an exercise of human freedom because they are afraid, because they are envious, because they want to preserve their power, whatever it might be. And the result is that it causes Jesus suffering. Secondly, and this comes a bit from the insight that Joe Schaub mentioned 2 times ago, that some of Jesus's suffering stems from his commitment to the kingdom and from the values of that kingdom and his consistent focus on those who are weak and his care and concern for those who are vulnerable. And this same section kind of includes the instances where Jesus' suffering serves as an example and a model for those who are his disciples who will be called upon to do the same. And we'll see that developed even more today in John's gospel. And that's going to be, by the way, one of the areas where we'll be able to draw some helpful insights as we look next time at the development of discipleship in general. Thirdly, we cannot get away from the fact that some of Jesus's suffering appears to originate beyond the human realm, what I've called kind of the cosmic struggle between good and evil. You might call it the nature theodicy. Suffering happens to Jesus because of Satan, because of the dark forces, whatever it might be, the powers of darkness. And we also see there are some instances when I made reference last time to a thing we call the divine necessity. In the Passion Predictions, the first one, in all 3 Synoptic Gospels, it says the Son of Man must suffer. And that verb that is used is a verb we call the divine necessity. It's an indication that there's something that God was willing in all of this. And finally, the last thing I wanted to mention is that the merger of the Old Testament images that originally were separate from God, Passover lamb, suffering servant, the righteous one who is persecuted. All of these images now being merged into the person of Jesus indicate that we're moving into a new way of understanding God's self-identification. I used the word last time, divinized. You might want to say that they are part of God's self-identity. But they're not only part of God's self-identity, they help us understand how God is going to engage in the cosmic battle. And how is he going to do it? Through suffering and through vulnerability. This is a striking contrast to the Old Testament image where God uses nature and where God uses other nations to bring about the divine will. Now we're going to see that God takes this upon the divine person's self in the person of Jesus as one who is suffering and who is vulnerable. Okay, so with that then, I wanted to talk now a little bit about these extra works that we're going to take a look at today. The first one of them is the letter to the Hebrews. A few things about the letter to the Hebrews. First of all of the things we say about the letter to the Hebrews aren't true. It's not a letter, it's not to the Hebrews, and it's not by Paul. So how's that for an interesting start? It's likely a sermon. It was probably written to Italian Gentile Christians, and it's an anonymous work. But for our purposes, it's an incredibly important work because it accompanies the readings on Good Friday. Two passages, Hebrews 4:14-16 and 5:7-9, and 5:7-9 are also read on the fifth Sunday of Lent in year B. So what does the letter of the Hebrews say? It's a lengthy letter. It's a very complicated letter. It's got a lot going on. I can't possibly begin to say all that's going on in there. It's one of its main arguments is it offers us insight into who Jesus is as the great high priest. And so a couple of basic statements. Jesus, the Son of God, and the letter affirms that Jesus is the Son of God, is the great high priest who sympathizes with our weakness. He is tested or was tested as we are, and yet never sinned. This idea of Jesus as Son of God and never having sinned is central to the argument. Then it says he had during his sojourn on earth, okay, his entire life, but particularly his ministry and his passion. During this, then there are specific moments that are highlighted. He offered prayers and supplications. What are we talking about here? His prayer in the garden, his cry on the cross. He pleaded with God that he might be freed from drinking the cup. And the letter says, and he was heard because of his reverent submission. And we might say, well, what does that mean he was heard? Well, what wasn't heard is that he would be freed from the cup. What was heard is that he would be vindicated, that in offering prayers and supplications, God heard his prayer and his supplication. And then we find this rather complex idea. He learned obedience through what he suffered, and his obedience and suffering made him, we oftentimes say perfect, but perhaps a better word is to say complete. That is, he is complete as the great high priest who is now in heaven. Having experienced obedience through what he suffered, and having suffered, he now is complete and is qualified to be the source of salvation for all people who turn to him. So, what's the purpose of the Passion? Well, we have to first of all know that the letter to the Hebrews has as its overall goal, it wants to help us, you and me, understand that our destiny is to share, ultimate destiny is to share God's intended glory rather than the earthly condition in which we find ourselves. So, it refers then to Jesus's exaltation as part of the divine plan. God had a design that is realized in Jesus coming to this earth, being made perfect or complete through his death and his exaltation to heavenly glory. And he is now capable of serving as our great high priest in heavenly glory. So having learned obedience through that suffering and having been made complete, he then makes it possible for us, you and me, to approach him because he is the source now of eternal salvation. He enables us, you and me, through his example, and having learned from that example, to achieve our own completion, our own perfection, which results in the end in an eternal relationship with God. We're going to see, especially in the reflection on Jesus's learning obedience through suffering, an ongoing theme that runs through what we're looking at in John's Gospel today. The other two readings that I wanted to look at are Paul's letter to the Philippians, one passage, and the first letter of Peter, several passages. So what about Paul's letter to the Philippians? Well, if you know the letter to the Philippians, it's written to one of Paul's absolutely favored communities. But no matter which community we're looking at with Paul, they always have some challenges, some difficulties. And in this case, there was an amount of division that was going on in the community because of rivalry. Who of us doesn't know what that's like? Rivalry can cause all kinds of divisions among us. And there were individuals who were asserting themselves, and this was bringing about a certain amount of division. So Paul wants to encourage the Philippian community to union and to unity with one another. He first offers himself as a model of one who has offered and sacrificed on their behalf. But he quickly turns to what he says is the perfect example, and that is Jesus's kenosis. The word kenosis is pouring out. So this is Jesus's self-emptying, his pouring out of himself as the model for unity. It's a famous hymn. You may actually recognize it. We're not sure if it was a pre-existing hymn or if Paul wrote it. There seems to be division there. Talk about lack of unity among scholars. Nevertheless, everyone agrees that it is a phenomenal piece of literature. It begins this way: though he was in the form of God, Jesus did not deem equality with God something to be grasped at, but rather emptied himself and took the form of a slave. Okay, so a few insights from the letter to the Philippians. First of all, it interprets the whole of Jesus's life, his pre-existence, his human sojourn, and his return to the Father in terms of an eternal divine plan. So Paul, more really than the Gospels, is a big proponent of the fact that there is this divine plan in God that is being fulfilled in Jesus. What's, I think, particularly important for us to remember is that this plan celebrates the fullness of his humanity together with the fullness of his divinity. We would be mistaken if we tried to subordinate one to the other. This is really trying to interpret the entirety of who he is and what he is about. What's important also to note is in laying down himself or not grasping his divinity, Jesus does something. He lets go of something that he already possesses fully. You know, you can't let go of what you don't have. He already possesses his divinity fully. He already knows who he is. Okay, he doesn't give himself away without having first possessed himself, in a sense. And so this is a profound image of him then letting go of the fullness of what he has in divinity to take on the fullness of humanity. And that's the reason for the emphasis all the way to humiliating death. It doesn't get more humbly human than that. And to those who listen to his message and those who look on his model, it encourages them to submit themselves to this same model of submission that Jesus presents to them. Now, what's then the purpose of Jesus's kenosis? Why the pouring out of oneself? One of the things that's really, I think, striking about it is that this emptying of his claim does not result in a diminishment, nor does it result in a separation. He's neither diminished nor is he separated from God. Rather, what it is it brings about a heightening form of union and exaltation. And it includes us. You know, he isn't diminished and he isn't separated from God, but in the process of entering into the human scene, he raises up humanity in exaltation and union with the Father. It suggests, yet again, this idea that human nature, apart from sin, has been incorporated into the divine nature, and that includes the experience of suffering. It reminds me again of Jürgen Moltmann's work on the crucified God, that from the time of Jesus on, the experience of crucifixion and the vulnerability of it and the suffering of it is a fundamental part of the divine nature. Finally, the last work we're going to look at is the first letter of Peter. And if you look on the left-hand side, you can see the range of this year, particularly First Peter will be the second reading for the second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and seventh Sundays of Easter. So we're going to hear from 2 Peter 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times this year in the Easter season. And it offers us a range of images of who Christ is. But I'm going to try to simplify it by doing this and looking at what does it say about Christ and what does it say about us as Christians. So these are little image snippets that I've pulled out of these passages. First of all, we are told he ransomed wayward believers through his precious blood as a spotless, unblemished lamb. There we have the lamb image again, and you can see this emphasis on him as being spotless and unblemished, and that he ransomed, as the Passover lamb ransoms the Hebrews from the fate of being destroyed to being liberated. Jesus ransomed us, wayward believers. Second, he is also called a living stone, rejected by human beings, but precious to God, who will serve then as the foundation of the spiritual house that all who believe in him are called to build. We're called to be stones as part of that living house. He is identified as the suffering servant. There's a lengthy passage there where we hear how he suffered here. I'll just read you a little bit. He committed no sin, and no deceit was found in his mouth. When he was insulted, he returned no insult. When he suffered, he did not threaten. He handed himself over to the one who judges justly. He bore our sins in his body upon the cross, so that free from death, from sin, we might live for righteousness. So you have this very, very powerful reflection of the suffering servant and also of the shepherd. He is the righteous one who suffers for sins. He dies and is resurrected. He is known before the foundation of the world. So it reminds us of the fact this is a divine plan that has been there from the beginning of time. And he reveals himself in the final time to those who are being saved. For our part as Christians, what are we called to be about? Well, we have a new birth to a living hope that is rooted in Christ's resurrection. But what's interesting is 1 Peter also reminds us that in spite of the fact that we have this living inheritance from Christ, we currently experience suffering. And our suffering, in part, is to test and to purify our faith. We're not told that it's a punishment. It is there for the testing and purifying of faith. And as a result of that, then we are also to be reverent and to allow ourselves to be built up into this spiritual house, which will result in these images: a holy priesthood, a chosen race, a holy nation, and God's holy people. The letter of Peter explicitly states that we are to suffer for doing good as Christ suffered for doing good. And we are even not only to suffer, but also to rejoice in sharing the sufferings of Christ. It's one of the most explicit examples of this teaching moving into the lives of the disciples as well. Okay. Now, with all of that, we're going to turn our attention to John's passion. And as I say, a very, very different account from what we have been seeing so far. Let me begin with a few overview points about this tradition. It is quite widely accepted that the Gospel of John, which, by the way, is also known as the fourth Gospel, was composed in the mid-90s. Also, it is quite clear from the gospel that it involved several stages of editing. There are two endings to the gospel. It looks like a second ending was added on. And then we have yet other things that seem to have been added on at later stages. And so it wasn't, I guess what I want to say, somebody didn't sit down and write this gospel from beginning to end in one setting. What we have here is we have editing, and it seems by at least one or two or three different individuals or groups of people. It is attributed, obviously, to John, who is also traditionally called the beloved disciple. I have to tell you that there are reasons for some scholars to think that we're not sure if John and the beloved disciple are the same person. Many believe that they are, others think not. There are reasons why. It's not really pertinent to our question. I just want to let you know. But no matter how you look at it, the gospel itself is deeply influenced by the ideas of the beloved disciple. And the beloved disciple plays a very prominent role, especially in the last part of this gospel. And the other thing I would say is that this gospel is strikingly different from what we have seen so far in the Synoptics. Even in scenes where we have the same information, it's going to be presented and emphasized differently. A couple of features of John's gospel that make it a challenge. First of all, there are no parables in John's gospel. And there aren't what you might call miracles, or certainly no expulsions of demons or anything of that sort in John's gospel. Rather, what we have in John are lengthy philosophical and mystical speeches on Jesus's part. If you were in church last week and you heard the full version of the Samaritan woman account, you will remember that Jesus has these lengthy and oftentimes quite difficult to follow kind of treatises, and they're all over the place in this gospel. So it's not easy language to follow. Secondly, many of the events that we will see and have seen already, but certainly in John, they're specifically identified as fulfillments of biblical prophecies. Matthew said sometimes the same thing, but it wasn't quite as explicit. John will say, this was in fulfillment of what was said and such for this reason. Thirdly, these lengthy discourses, as I mentioned a minute ago, often result in misunderstanding. Again, I'll go back to the story of the Samaritan woman. She doesn't understand at first what Jesus is talking about. She keeps thinking that he's talking about some kind of source of water that will mean that she doesn't have to keep coming back and drawing water. And of course, he's not. But the disciples don't understand him either. They think that somebody's been feeding him, and he says, my food is not, I have food that you don't know of, and they completely miss the point. And this happens over and over and over again in this gospel. Misunderstanding is rife everywhere. Pilate doesn't understand Jesus. The disciples don't understand Jesus. The chief priest doesn't understand Jesus. Nicodemus doesn't understand Jesus. You name it, he seems to be constantly misunderstood. A famous one, when he multiplies bread in chapter 6 of John's gospel, and he says that he's giving them, you have to eat of this bread. This is my body. And they're appalled. They think that he's promoting cannibalism. And so we have this constant misunderstanding. Fourth point that I would point out is that although the cosmic battle between good and evil plays a big role in this gospel, it's done in an almost completely non-apocalyptic manner. What I mean by that is that all of the signs of apocalypses, like the darkness falling over the land, doesn't happen in John. There's no tearing of the temple of the veil of the temple. There's no breaking open of rocks or tombs opening up or any of these kinds of things. It's a strikingly non-apocalyptic cosmic battle. But at the same time, it's very clear that Jesus wins the battle at the end. There is no doubt that God triumphs. Finally, the other part that there are some key words that you need to be aware of in John. The world is oftentimes the designation for the realm of evil. In fact, we'll hear that, the prince of the world is another one of the ways of talking about Satan. I mentioned a while ago, Jesus doesn't do any miracles to speak of. What he does in John are signs, and there are 7 of them. The last of them is going to get our scenes beginning, and that's the 7th sign is the raising of Lazarus. And that's the sign that actually triggers the hour. And then, of course, we have the hour itself. And the hour in Jesus's understanding of things is the moment when the divine plan now moves forward to its completion. Earlier in the gospel, when right after Jesus comes on the scene, when we have the first of the signs, which is the water changing to wine at Cana, Jesus says to Mary, "It is not my hour." And that's because it is not yet the moment when this, but he nevertheless does a great act, a great sign. The other thing I want to point out is that the reason for the signs is to bring people to faith. And indeed, at the very end of the gospel, it is said, "These are the signs, and they have been provided for you so that you may believe that Jesus is indeed the Son of God." All right. Now, I want to talk a little bit about some distinctions between John and the Synoptic Gospels. And these are important distinctions because they really move the two traditions in different directions. So first of all, a really simple thing, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, because they are all related, they record, or they tell us about 1 year of Jesus's ministry. John's gospel, on the other hand, tells us of 3 years of Jesus's ministry. So the timing is different. I'll give you a real simple example. In the Synoptics, because Jesus is only in Jerusalem at the very end of his life, there is the cleansing of the temple. In John's gospel, it happens at the beginning because he was in Jerusalem more than one time. We don't know historically if there were 2 cleansings, if there was only 1 cleansing and it was at the beginning, or if there was only 1 cleansing and it was at the end. The difficulty we face is because the timing is different. There's no way of making a determination. Secondly, the Synoptic Gospels, in varying degrees, with Mark being the most conservative, the focus most on Jesus's humanity, the Synoptics tend to emphasize Jesus's humanity even as they admit to his growing understanding of his divinity. Mark the least, Luke and Matthew much more so. John, it's the flip reverse. In John's gospel, Jesus is well aware of his origins and his divine nature from the very beginning. This gospel begins with the prologue. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So we have this very powerful emphasis on Jesus's self-understanding. He's well aware of his relationship with his Father throughout this gospel. Thirdly, the title most frequently focused on for Jesus in the Synoptics is Jesus the Messiah, the Son of God. In John's gospel, Jesus is the incarnate Word. He's the Word spoken by God, who then takes flesh. And we hear in that poem that he dwelt among us. The word literally is he pitched his tent among us. That is, the Word of God descends to earth and becomes one with humanity, takes on human flesh. The fourth distinction between these two traditions is that we have the 3 evangelists in the Synoptic accounts, each with his own perspective, his own given community. In John, the person that we're talking about is the beloved disciple. And it's a very different tradition, clearly shaped by the experience of the beloved disciple, who is Jesus's intimate friend in this gospel. Several times, the beloved disciple takes a proximity to Jesus that Peter could only wish for. For example, as the 2 of them are running to the tomb after Mary Magdalene reports to them that the body is gone, the beloved disciple gets there first. And he peers in, and it says in the end that he walked away and he believed. It doesn't say that about Peter. Peter wondered, and Peter was slower, and it took him longer to get there. Or at the Last Supper, when Jesus says that one of you will betray me, the beloved disciple is sitting next to Jesus, and he leans back on Jesus's chest because Peter has asked him, find out who it is. And then the beloved disciple hears Jesus say, it's the one that I dip the morsel of bread in the dish with. That's the one. And then, of course, it ends up being Judas. So we see numerous instances where the beloved disciple is privileged in a way that we don't see that in the other gospels. And then finally, the last, and this is an unfortunately development in John. Whereas we had chief priests and elders and scribes in the Synoptics who were Jesus's opponents, in John's gospel, it's a much broader term. He uses the word the Jews. The people who oppose Jesus are the Jews. It's an unfortunate, imprecise term because, to be honest, the Jews includes Mary, and it includes the disciples, and it includes all kinds of people who do believe in Jesus and who are convinced of who he is. But it's used as this negative term, likely similar to what we saw with Matthew, where there was tension in the 90s between the Johannine community and its parent Jewish community, and this spills over into the language that is used in the gospel, unfortunately. All right. Now, these are the scenes that we find that are common between Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And yet, even as I mentioned that they hold these scenes in common, I have to already begin by saying that John oftentimes alters them rather drastically. We'll look at the conspiracy in a little bit, because we have to come back to it. But I want to move to the anointing at Bethany. And whereas in the earlier accounts, it was an unnamed woman, and it was in the household of Simon the leper, that is in Matthew and Mark, now we hear that this takes place in the home of Mary and Martha and Lazarus in Bethany. And it's Mary who anoints now Jesus's feet, and she dries them with her hair. And it is Judas Iscariot who criticizes both Mary's action as well as the fact that the oil could have been sold and the money given to the poor. And Jesus, as in the other accounts, criticizes him and comes to Mary's defense. When we turn to the royal entrance in Jerusalem, we have an interesting addition, and that is because all of this has taken place after the raising of Lazarus, and there's a huge interest in Lazarus in this gospel. We hear that the people who are crowding to see Jesus are there because they heard that he did this sign of raising Lazarus from the dead. When we move on to the Last Supper and the betrayal and the denial, we're going to see some really rather striking changes. First of all, the biggest change and one of the biggest problems is the fact that the Last Supper does not take place at the time of the Passover meal. It takes place the day before. This is the day before the preparation when Jesus has a meal with his disciples. The second big problem is that there is no meal. Nobody eats anything. The only thing that happens is that Jesus washes feet, and then he has 4 chapters worth of a discourse towards the disciples, some of which we will look at today. This is the scene where Jesus predicts Judas's betrayal. But as I said, the beloved disciple is the one who is featured rather than Peter. And we also hear in that scene that the moment that Judas takes the morsel from Jesus, Satan enters him, and it says, and it was night. This is clearly now the hour is in full bloom, where Satan and the forces of evil and the powers of darkness are all gathering to take on Jesus, who is the Son of Light and the Son of God. Moving to Gethsemane, this scene is completely transformed. There is no agony in the garden. There is no praying. Jesus enters the garden, comes to the place where the oil press is, and waiting for him practically are Judas and now a cohort of Roman soldiers, 600 soldiers in this small space, together with the officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees. And what is so striking, and I want to emphasize, in this gospel, Jesus is always really in control. He knows what is happening. So they come forward and he interrogates them. And this happens over and over again in this Passion account. Jesus is the one who does the interrogating. So they come up and he says, well, who are you looking for? And they say, Jesus of Nazareth. And he says, I am Some of you may know or recognize that word I am. We're going to see this play a really important role. It's the divine name. If you don't know the story behind it, let me just fill it in quickly. In the book of Exodus, when Moses is asked by God at the burning bush to go and to rescue his people from Egypt, Moses says to God, well, who are you? What am I supposed to say to the people? And God responds, tell them I am sent you. This is the divine name, all right? And Jesus uses this very cleverly throughout the Gospel of John. We're going to see a whole series of identifications called the I am identifications, or the I am sayings. Well, here in the garden, Jesus responds, I am. And do you know what the response is? If any of you remember reading it, the whole cohort of 600 fall to the ground. It's kind of reminiscent of, there's a legend that when Moses revealed to Pharaoh the name of God, I am, Pharaoh fell to the ground. So the divine name is a name with huge power, and Jesus uses that power. Nevertheless, because he is in control of everything and knows that this is what has to happen, he tells the cohort when they get back up that he's the one to be arrested and that they should let the disciples go. It doesn't prevent Peter, and we now know who it is that cuts the ear off. It's Simon Peter, who strikes with the sword and cuts off the ear of Malchus, the high priest's slave. In the end, the cohort seizes Jesus and they bind him and lead him away to the Jewish trial. The Jewish trial, again, another major change. They bring Jesus not to the house of Caiaphas, but rather to his son-in-law's house, Annas. And there is no trial to speak of. They haven't lined up any witnesses or anything of the sort. Jesus is brought there and he immediately launches into an interrogation. Why haven't you arrested me before? I was in the temple every day. You could have arrested me. Why have you come out against me like I'm a thief or a criminal of some kind? And this is what consists of the interrogation in the household of Annas. It's clear, as we will see in a moment, that the leadership, now that they have Jesus, their main focus is to get him to Pontius Pilate and to destroy him. And so, and also I should mention that Peter's denial follows along much the same path as it does in the Synoptic Gospels, and that takes place in parallel stages as the trial unfolds. Finally, Jesus is brought before Pontius Pilate. And again, main storyline is the same, but with many alterations. Because the chief priests and the Pharisees want to celebrate the Passover, they won't go into Pilate's chambers, the praetorium, because they don't want to be defiled. But it's also clear that they want Jesus dead. So when Pilate asks them why they're there, they say, well, it's not lawful for us to put anyone to death. They haven't even offered any reason as to why Jesus should be put to death, but they are convinced that he should, and they bring him to Pilate with that. This results in a lengthy conversation between Jesus and Pontius Pilate over his kingship and over truth. And if you remember in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus was relatively silent in Pilate's presence. He didn't say much of anything. Because Pilate doesn't seem to be getting anywhere, he then has Jesus scourged, and he brings him out before the crowd of the people. And this is the famous "Behold the man" scene. And when the people see him, because Pilate has said he finds no crime in Jesus, we then have the leadership whipping the people up to saying that we have a law, and the law says that he should die because he made himself the Son of God. So now we're finally getting at the heart of the issue. And we're going to see that there are two issues. The first one is that he's perceived as having made himself the Son of God. And then secondly, after this, when Pilate still demurs and is not quite sure what to do, he talks about releasing Jesus. They say, well, if you release him, then you are no friend of Caesar's, because everyone who makes himself a king sets himself against Caesar. So there's the second charge. Jesus is claiming to be the Son of God, and he is also setting himself up as a king against Caesar. And the height of irony is a little later when the chief priests cry out, "We have no king but Caesar." Of course, the whole reason why there was a Jewish revolution was because they didn't want Caesar as their king. And so we have this irony going on here. It leads us then to the crucifixion. And again, we're going to see a quite different unfolding of the events. First of all, Simon of Cyrene is not needed. Jesus is the Son of God. He knows who he is. He is powerful and strong enough to carry the cross himself. So he carries the cross, no assistance from anyone. Secondly, after he has been crucified, there's a great deal of conversation that goes on, argument really, between Pilate and the chief priests about the inscription over Jesus's head, which says, "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews." And they object, and Pilate says, "What I have written, I have written." A third very striking difference is the fact that Jesus's mother, his mother's sister, Mary Magdalene, and the beloved disciple are all at the foot of the cross. It's a tough question to know whether that's historical or not, primarily because family members usually were not allowed anywhere near the one being crucified. But here in this instance, we have this. And probably for the important reason that Jesus entrusts his mother and the disciple to one another. So there's a theological reason that overrides the historical concern here to make sure that that conversation is recorded. The next major distinction is the fact that there is no abuse of Jesus on the cross. Nobody is yelling things at him or hurling abuse at him in any way. And then finally, a kind of striking thing, which leads us again to wonder about his humanity. It says Jesus thirsts, but then it says immediately he thirsts to fulfill Scripture. So again, I remember I said earlier on that there's this strong emphasis on fulfilling the elements of Scripture. And so it's not really he thirsts because he's thirsty. It's he has to thirst because he has to fulfill Scripture. In the end, after having drunk that little bit of wine, we hear that he bows his head and he gives over his spirit. There are no words uttered. He doesn't cry out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" He doesn't even say, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they're doing." He doesn't say, "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit," as he did in Luke. None of those things. He simply bows his head and turns over his spirit. And then we have the fact that there are no cosmic portents. There is no tearing of the temple veil. There is no darkness over the land. No mention that there was darkness over the land. The centurion doesn't say anything. In contrast to Matthew and Mark that said, "Truly this is the Son of God," or Luke, where the centurion said, "This man is innocent." In John, the centurion is silent. But there are two actions that are important. First of all, at the end, we hear that they want to take the bodies down from the cross, and we hear that Jesus's legs are not broken. This is to fulfill the prophecy about the Passover lamb. None of its bones are to be broken. So again, another identification of Jesus with the Passover lamb. And then we hear that a soldier pierces his side, an affirmation of his humanity because blood and water pour out. This also is a fulfillment of Zechariah chapter 12, verse 10. And in the very end, it says, all of this is provided to us by an eyewitness. And it says, he has provided us with this testimony so that we might come to believe. Finally, the last scene is the burial. There are no women at this burial, in contrast to all of the others. The women are not involved. This time, Joseph of Arimathea, who is identified as a secret believer, is accompanied by Nicodemus, and they bring along all kinds of spices and linens and treat the body in the full manner that it should be, and it is placed in a newly hewn out tomb in which no one had previously been buried. So, many of the same elements, but quite different. All right. Now, I am keeping an eye on my clock, and I only have about, it looks to me like about 9 or 10 minutes. So I'm going to move through a few things fairly quickly here. I want to start by just saying that one of the accusations one of the explanations given for why Jesus is destroyed is that the high priest prophesied it. And the high priest had the ability to be a prophet. So in the very first scene, you see there, the chief priests and the Pharisees take counsel against Jesus. This is following Lazarus, the raising of Lazarus. They come together and they're at their wits' end. How are we going to stop this man? And the chief priest gets up and he says this: Jesus should die for the nation, and not for the nation only, but to gather into one the children of God who are scattered abroad. And of course, indeed, that is one of the purposes of Jesus's death, as we're told in the overall tradition. They send out word then that people are to be watching for Jesus because they want to try to find him and put him to death. Jesus, as a result of this, retires to Ephraim. And we hear an interesting little sideline here that the chief priests and the Pharisees are plotting against Lazarus too, because they want to get him out of the way, because people are believing in Jesus because of Lazarus. So they figure if they destroyed Lazarus, then maybe they can destroy Jesus too. That brings me to the Greeks who seek Jesus. This is a complicated passage, but a really important one. And so I just want to mention 2 or 3 things about it. This is the moment when Jesus says, the hour now has come. The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. And that's how he describes what is going to happen to him. This is going to be his glorification. He uses the image, rather than talking about his death being a forgiveness of sins, he says that he is going to die like a grain of wheat that falls to the ground and dies so that it bears fruit. It's a much more positive image in a certain sense. It gets away from the expiatory language to talk about the fact that Jesus is his death is going to produce something new. And he also says this is a model for anyone who wants to follow him. If you love your life, you'll lose it. If you hate it in this world, you'll keep it for eternal life. It then leads to his one and only statement where Jesus is worried about whether he should go through with this or not. This is found in chapter 12, verse 27, and he says this: "Now is my soul troubled, and what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour? No, for this purpose I have come to this hour." That, in my mind, is the shortest doubt that I've ever encountered in the biblical tradition. It consists of about 8 words, and then he says, "Nope, I've got myself back on track. I'm here for the hour," and there's never another doubt that comes across his mind after that. He uses it, however, as an opportunity to explain what the hour means. It's the judgment of the world, he says. It's the moment when the ruler of this world will be cast out. Think Satan, okay? When he will be lifted up on the cross. And what we have to remember here is the image that's being called upon is the raising up of the serpent on the pole in the Mosaic tradition, where people were bitten by serpents. And if they looked upon the serpent mounted on a pole, they would be healed and they would live. And Jesus is saying the same. All who look on him and who believe in him will be healed and they will live. Now, all of this, of course, takes place against the backdrop of unbelief. And that's a constant throughout this gospel tradition. I'd love to be able to talk more about it, but we just don't have time for it. So what I want to do is I want to move to the last 3 things here, and I have some separate material on each of them. So let me do that now. And I think we can skip this and this. Okay, so we turn to the washing of the feet. It's one of the things that we act out liturgically, and I thought it was important because what we have here in these scenes is first of all, Jesus provides a model for discipleship for the long haul. He is getting ready to leave. He's going to be departing from them, and they are going to hear this message that he's going to be departing. And so what he does is he wants to establish a pattern of behavior and a mode of life that they can live as they live in what we're going to call the in-between time. So what do we have here? Let me find it. There we are. Okay. In this scene, we have primarily Jesus. The first part of it, the first 5 verses, is Jesus reflects on his own self-awareness. He knows where he's come from. He knows that he's returning to the Father, and now he wants to offer the disciples an example that will sustain them. Okay. So he starts off by talking about the hour. This is the moment when he's going to leave this world. And this is going to be marked by the greatest sign of his love to this point. From this point on, he's not going to be talking of them as disciples anymore. They are his friends. They are his beloved children. And all of this is motivated by his relationship with the Father. He's strengthened by the fact that he's returning to the Father, and so he sets aside his garments and he engages in this act of selfless service. The second part of it is, of course, that Peter objects. Peter always objects. He wouldn't be Peter if he didn't object. So he says, well, you can't wash my feet. And Jesus says to him very powerfully, unless I wash your feet, you can't have any part of me. And what's going on here? Well, obviously, for us Christians, it's referring to baptism. And what is happening here is John is focusing on the relationship between baptism and the death of Jesus. By washing their feet, the disciples are being invited to have a part of Jesus, which includes the self-giving love that he is engaging in right there and will be engaging in on the cross. We oftentimes think of baptism as washing away sins and as some kind of wonderful inheritance. It is a wonderful inheritance, but it's an inheritance that invites us into self-giving love. That's the part that Jesus invites the disciples into. If they truly are incorporated into him, that means that they are going to have to exercise the same kind of self-giving love towards one another and towards others as he has done for them. And that means even to the point of death. He expresses all of this ultimately in a thing called the New Commandment. He now calls them no longer his disciples. He calls them my little children. He calls them his friends. And he gives them this commandment, which is an articulation of what he has just done. They are to follow him into the loving self-gift, even to death, if need be. And it's an exercise of love that is quite profound. He does this. He washes their feet, and he is going to lay down himself for them, even knowing that they are betraying him, even knowing that they are sinful, even knowing that they don't understand what he is about. He still does this, and this is what he asks of his disciples as well. Finally, there are 14, 15, 16, 17, 4 chapters that are unique in John's gospel called the Farewell Discourse. These 4 chapters are very complex, but I'd like to just talk about them in a kind of a summarized manner. First of all, I'm going to follow them by following a couple of I am statements. But ultimately, I also want to point out that they serve kind of as a model for a community in the in-between time. That is, Jesus is saying to the disciples, I'm leaving. Before I return, you still have to be together. You still have to be active. And how are you going to do this? You're going to do it in a number of ways. So there are 5 titles that I would just point to here. First of all, he says, I'm going to prepare a place for you. Part of what Jesus is about is he wants to bring union between himself, the Father, and the community that is around him. And he does this by saying, I'm going to prepare a place for you, and I will come back and bring you to that place myself. And so there's this relationship that he is establishing with them. Secondly, he says, he is the way. He is the way to the Father. And he and the Spirit are the truth. And the life that he's referring to is the life that they will form together as all those who have come together along this way. Thirdly, he says, I'm in the Father and the Father is in me. In case they haven't quite figured this thing out yet, what Jesus has done is what the Father has given him to do, and now he wants the disciples to continue that work as, in a certain sense, in him and in the Father. So how is this to be accomplished? Well, he uses the image of the vine. He says, I am the vine, and my Father is the one who is the vine dresser. So you have to remain connected to me, and the Father is the one who makes all of the growth possible. The Father does this by caring for the vine, also pruning the vine when it's necessary. And that ultimately, the only way that you can be fruitful as a follower of mine is if you are attached to me as vines are to a branch. And it's not just about existence. It's not just about being attached to Jesus as a vine is to a branch. It's about being fruitful. There's action involved here. There's fruit that is to be produced. It isn't just a passive state. It's a state which is supposed to result in fruitfulness. It spills over in the end into the reiteration of Jesus's great commandment. Love one another as I have loved you. Jesus becomes the great model. I told you a minute ago, he lays down his life. He loves without limit. Despite the fact that the disciples are ignorant, despite the fact that one of them is a betrayer, despite the fact that others will deny him, past and present failures are not held against them in this process. All of this is a pretty big ask. So how are the disciples supposed to do it? Well, the final point is in the in-between time, Jesus will send the Paraclete, the advocate, the one who will assist the disciples. His departure to return to where he came from leaves them and us now, even in this time, in a thing we might call the in-between time. The departure then demands that there's some kind of link, some oneness that has to exist between the Father and the disciples in this in-between time until it is fully realized. And so how is that accomplished? Well, through the role of the Paraclete. The Paraclete, the advocate, the Spirit, reveals what Jesus taught, fills in the blanks, and indeed also it says the Spirit will also instruct you about that which you haven't yet heard. Because Jesus, of course, lived in a limited time and space, and there would be other challenges and questions that needed to be responded to. And so he recommends the Spirit as the one who will assist the disciples as they move forward. Indeed, he even says, you will do greater things than I. It's clear that he expects this community to be an active and alive one. And all of this is possible not because of Jesus or the Paraclete alone, but rather because of the one who is the source of it all, which is the divine communion. The truth of all of this comes from the union of Father, Son, and Spirit. I have talked about these things, so I'm going to skip this and this and this and this and move to this. The purpose of the Passion, as we find it in John's Gospel, is probably best articulated in its very beginning, the prologue, which I recommend going back and reading the first 18, 19 verses of John's Gospel. We hear it, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And we hear that those who do accept Jesus have received the power to become the children of God. They are born not of natural generation nor of human choice or by human decision, but rather they are born of God. And in this powerful line, it says, the Word, Jesus now, the Word became flesh. He pitched his tent, made his dwelling among us. We saw his glory, the glory as of the Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. This is the destiny that the Johannine community believes they receive from Jesus. He came, dwelt among them, gave them the pathway to move forward to an eternal relationship with God. So why did Jesus suffer? Well, he suffered for the nation. He suffered to gather people into one. He suffered to be exalted and glorified so that he could return to the Father. He suffered to bear fruit, and so that he could return to the Father. He suffered to demonstrate his love, and he taught the disciples to do the same. So let me end with this. Jesus chose to suffer so that the advocate could come. This we find in chapter 16, verse 7. And it, in a sense, it unleashes a model for Christian living in the present time, in the in-between time. The Paraclete reminds the believers of Jesus's teachings, but also informs believers with a new dynamism that enables them to take on the unforeseen and new challenges. He reminds us that he would do greater things, that we would do greater things than he. So what is required then of us if we are to follow this path? Well, Jesus says, keep my commandment, love one another as I have loved you. And using the image of the vine and the branches, stay connected to the vine and open yourself to the pruning of the Father. So with that, I realize I'm a little over time. And I'll just put this up there for a moment. This is the material that you will find for the next session. And I want to stop the screen sharing now so that we can talk a little bit. Anybody have any questions or comments? Okay, let me stop that. And I think Matthew has unmuted you. At least it looks like it to me. So I realized that was a really fast walk through John. It's more challenging, isn't it, when we're talking about teachings than it is when we're talking about actions. But anyways, anyone?
Again, you brought up suffering. And the question I have about the suffering, is the suffering a sign of Jesus's solidarity with those who are suffering, those of us who are suffering, or is our suffering a sign of our solidarity with Jesus? Which is it?
Well, what I would, first of all, as I mentioned earlier on, there are at least 4 different dimensions to that I can see there as to why suffering happens. But when we talk about Jesus is suffering a solidarity with us, or our suffering a solidarity with him, in a certain sense, I'd say it was both. If I said earlier on, and I did, that one of the things it seems to me that's happening is, as we see the Gospels unfolding, is that identification with human suffering becomes a characteristic of the divine nature. That is, Jesus, through his humanity and through his accepting of suffering, he suffers on behalf of humanity, but he also suffers with people. Even in a gospel like John, there was a 4 times where Jesus's humanity becomes really obvious. One is when he's talking with Mary, the sister of Lazarus, and she's weeping, and it says that Jesus was profoundly troubled by what he was experiencing. Or when we hear that he goes to the tomb of Lazarus and he weeps. He also is troubled by the final betrayal of Judas. In each instance, it talks about the fact that and these are the only instances when this word troubled is used. So clearly, and we saw it earlier in the earlier Gospels as well, like in Luke, where Jesus is deeply moved over the suffering of Jerusalem. He's deeply moved by the women that he meets on the road as he's walking to Calvary. He is moved by the suffering of the thief on the cross next to him. So clearly, Jesus's humanity resonates with their suffering, which leads to his own level of suffering. On the other hand, we can say that his model, certainly if you look at things like the letter to the Hebrews or Philippians, we are encouraged to identify our suffering, or 1 Peter, we are encouraged to identify our suffering with his. That is, he offers us a model. We should be rejoicing. 1 Peter says, rejoice insofar as you suffer for doing good, because that's what the Lord Jesus did. So I don't know if you wanted one or the other, Don, but I'm thinking it's probably both. Mm-hmm. What do you think?
I would tend to agree.
Okay. Yeah. Maria.
Yeah, so I'm glad that you emphasized the paraclete, because for people who are alive today, and I think this is an important thing to look at, I remember this when I was teaching kids, if Jesus met people then, guided people then, lived with people then, gave models then, who helps us now? Because we're so far removed from that. And I don't think people actually spend enough time thinking about the actual presence for us 2,000 years later, after the fact. We can't see, we can't touch, we can't put our hands in Jesus's, wounds or anything like that. It's all about, how do you believe without seeing? How do you continue to live this life? And what we have is this spirit. That's it. We don't have the historical Jesus. I mean, there are days, I'm sure, that everybody walks around and they wish, where is Jesus? And the thing is, where is the spirit? See,
Right.
I think that's the most important thing. That's what guides us. And I think that's why Paul spent so much time talking about how important it is to discern the spirit. And I think the Pope, this Francis, more than any recent Pope, talk so much about discernment, because it's that engagement with the living spirit of God with us present 2,000 years after the fact of Jesus, that gives us that connection, and as you said, and you get that connection staying attached to the vine. So thanks for pointing that out, because I think the spirit is an underemphasized element in the Gospels, except for the Gospel of John. In the other ones, he's the bird that comes down, or the dove,
Right, yeah.
some thing with wings, saying, this is my beloved son. But
Right.
this is, you can see where you begin to get this other person of the Trinity in this gospel.
Well, and you also, what's so wonderful about it is that John's gospel makes so clear. Yes, he will help us understand what Jesus taught, but he also opens us up to responding to what is new that Jesus didn't teach. Jesus lived in a limited period of time. And I think the challenge that I see that we face in our life now is, where do we find the voice of the Spirit? And the church institutionally has always tried to sit there and hammer it into saying, well, it comes through the voice of your bishop, or it comes through the voice of your priest, but it's much bigger than that. And it's why I think that, in a sense, the Spirit has been de-emphasized, because it's uncontrollable. You can't control the Spirit the way you can control priests or orders or other kinds of things. You can't define it. And it's a dynamism, and it does it cause problems? Yeah, I mean, the history of the Johannine community showed that it was problematic, because if you don't have a hierarchical line, which you didn't in John's community, you have, everybody has the Spirit, and everybody is capable then of responding. And if everybody is doing it according to what I said, in terms of really following the law of love, and also remaining joined to the vine, it can work. But the moment that any of those pieces are gone, it can turn into chaos. So yeah, I agree with you, Maria, 100%. Anyone else? I don't know what, Matthew, you're going to have to tell me when it's over.
I think, what time is it?
I have 7:16, but that's Midwestern time. So
Right, so it's 8:16 here. So I think if nobody else has any other comments, I think that's it. So thank you, Steve. I'm glad I'm back. I'm sorry I missed it
I'm
last
glad
week,
to see you, Maria.
but I'm glad you're here. And thanks everybody for coming. I wish all of you a good evening. And Steve, thanks for all your wonderful preparation. You're a true teacher. We're all teachers. And I think we can really appreciate all the work that goes into your preparation. So thank you, everyone. Have a good night. It was wonderful to see you all. Thanks, Steve, and stay warm out there in the Midwest.
Will do. Take care,
Good night,
everyone. Yeah.
Good night.